Well, nothing's cut and dry in the digital age, especially when it comes to scientific research. When an academic study pops up online, you might assume it's been vetted. But today, a growing number of so-called predatory journals are pumping out dubious research and junk science. This is a world I honestly knew very little about until I read Timothy Caulfield's book, The Certainty Illusion. Now, Timothy is a professor of law at the University of Alberta with a research focus on health misinformation. Great to have you back on the show, Tim.
Thanks for having me on.
So when we're talking predatory journals, how big is this problem?
Yeah, this is a huge problem. It's not a little niche issue. I think it's fair to say that tens of millions of dollars, mostly coming from publicly funded grants, by the way, tens of millions of dollars from around the world are being funneled into these publications, and they're absolutely everywhere. This is an international problem, and it is polluting. It's polluting our knowledge base. It's having an adverse impact on how we make decisions about everything from healthcare to engineering. I mean, this is a absolutely massive problem that is polluting our knowledge base.
And we see so many more, articles being retracted. That's not just predatory journals, but I saw a stat that 10,000 articles in 2023, academic articles, were retracted. Predatory journals are part of that problem. I mean, that just sounds like an astounding number to me, because 10,000 articles, 10,000 studies, like, people would have looked at that. People would have read those.
That's right. And predatory journals are kind of symbolic of a broader issue, right? Where this degradation of our knowledge base, as I've called it. And when you talk about retraction, that's a good thing. We want bad studies to be retracted. That's part of the process. But unfortunately, we're seeing more and more of these poor quality studies, work their way into the scientific literature. And by the way, often these studies are referenced in systematic reviews. They're referenced in clinical guidelines. So, this isn't just a theoretical problem. This is a real problem that's doing serious harm.
Okay, it trickles down. I want to come to that in a little bit. I want to ask, though, what separates a predatory journal from a legitimate one?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, and I wish we could come up with a simple answer, because I think this is one of the policy challenges, because really the journals fall on a continuum, right? So it is hard to draw, a really bright red line that, these journals are terrible and these journals are okay. But I think big picture in general, these predatory journals have very little real peer review, or sometimes no peer review at all. And peer review is critical. Having your colleagues review your work before it gets published is critical for high quality science. Often they don't have real editorial boards, or very suspect editorial boards. Often they publish extremely quickly, which is a big red flag, because it takes time to do peer review, to actually do the edits, to get it out. So, quick publication can also be a red flag. There's Bottom line, these are journals that don't satisfy the criteria for an academic journal. So basically, you just pay these publishers money. They take your money and they put the say low quality stuff out there, and unfortunately, this industry is growing, and it preys on this publish or perish ethos that permeates the academic world. We want to get as many publications as we can. Unfortunately, that's often how our worth is measured. So they prey on that, right? To create this massive industry.
So are they always reaching out? Are you being approached?
Oh, constantly. I'd probably get an offer, for sure, once a day, sometimes dozens of times a day.
Wow.
Saying, come publish in esteemed scholar, and then they'll ask me to publish in a nuclear physics journal, something I know nothing about, and it can look very legitimate. And the offer, and it can be tempting. If you've done work in an area and then you get this invite to publish, you want to get your work out there ASAP. So I get why scholars can fall for it.
When I'm learning about this, I think, is a researcher that says yes a victim or a perpetrator?
Yeah, another great question. And and I think it's complex, right? And again, I think it falls on a continuum. I know that sometimes there are people that are fully aware that this is a predatory journal, and sometimes there are bad actors who just want to get something that looks legitimate so they can sell an unproven therapy, for example, and they want to put the study on their website to justify the product. You have those kinds of bad actors, so they know it's a predatory journal and they publish it in any way. In fact, they probably pick the predatory journal because they know they can get it out. Then sometimes you have, I think, researchers who are in a panic, just they want to get this work out there, and okay, this doesn't look like the best journal in the world, but I'll do it anyway. And then there's some on the other side that, they're tricked by these emails. Often the name of the journal is very close to the name of a legitimate journal,
Right.
and it can look very convincing, and they publish in it and they don't realize. So I think it happens really across that continuum. But for the consumer, for the research community, for our knowledge base, it almost doesn't matter what the intention is. All of that publishing does harm.
All of it does harm. I want to talk about one of the researchers that was a victim. Alan Chambers is an American researcher who was duped by a predatory journal, and this is how he felt.
Yeah, it was a little bit wind out of my sails, but at the same time, it was a discovery process of not understanding fully the magnitude of what was going on, still questioning whether it was predatory or not. It did take a seasoned professional, someone that had been doing this for decades, to help me see through the fog to identify this for what it really was.
So Tim, even after he found out that journal was predatory, he tried to get, his work, not published, and they still printed it, which is crazy. You think about that, like his stuff is still out there, even though he tried to stop the train. But I think about people at home, and you talked about those harms. I may be sitting at home thinking, okay, that's for the researchers, but how does this trickle down to me if I'm not in the scientific community?
Yeah, well, first of all, the public should be angry because these journals are largely funded by peer-reviewed research grants that are funded by your tax dollars, right? So these are, publicly funded grants that often support these journals. And so I don't think that should be allowed. So that's one reason why you should care. The second reason why you should care is it is polluting the academic literature. So, as I said before, things like, clinical guidelines or systematic reviews on that are used to inform policy. It hurts all of that analysis, and it makes it more difficult for all of us to tease out what's good science and what's bad science, especially in this chaotic information environment, right, where it's already incredibly noisy.
It is.
The other reason I think it's really important is because these journals, publications in these journals are often used to push nonsense, right? To push anti-vax nonsense, to push climate change, anti-climate change nonsense, to push a whole host of unscientific ideas because they can look really legitimate. So if you, for example, go to some clinician's website and they're offering some unproven therapy and you click on the study, and most people won't even go that far, right? So you're trying to be diligent. You're trying to go, to click through to look at the study, and you're met with this study that looks legitimate but was published in a predatory journal. It might fool you. And I totally get that because, you've already taken the time to do that and you land on a real study, something that looks like a real study. It can be very convincing.
Tim, do you have a real world example where you've seen that happen?
Yeah, so there are lots of examples. In the book, I talk about what I think is a great example, and it's for something called the O shot, okay? And I know this is a PG TV show, so I want to be careful describing what the O shot is
Please
for.
do.
But it's a PRP injection into a woman's private parts in order to improve sexual performance. I'll put it that way.
Okay.
No evidence or no good evidence to support this. It's become a huge industry, and it really all started with a study that was published in a predatory journal. And if you go to these clinics that are offering the O shot, that study is still often used. I think it's like a decade old now to justify the procedure.
Scary examples, Timothy. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. It's something that we all need to be talking about. And as always, great to have you on the program.
Thanks for having me on.